When Alex Miller, a 28-year-old mechanic drowning in debt, chose to fix a stranded biker's broken-down Harley for free, he saw only a man in a tight spot, not the leather-clad herald of a coming storm. He ignored the stack of final notices on his desk and the gnawing hunger in his own stomach, acting on a simple, deeply ingrained principle of helping someone who needed it. He had no way of knowing that this single act of compassion, performed in the failing light of a Tuesday evening, would set in motion a chain of events that would bring 200 of the world's most infamous motorcyclists thundering into his quiet town a week later, not for retribution, but for a rescue he never knew he needed. The garage smelled of defeat. It was a cocktail of old oil, cold steel, and the faint, dusty scent of forgotten dreams. Alex's father had built Miller's Auto and Repair with his own two hands, and for 30 years it had been a town institution. Now it was a tomb. The hydraulic lift stood empty, casting long, skeletal shadows across the stained concrete floor. Tools, once meticulously organized, lay scattered on workbenches, monuments to jobs that were no longer coming in. The main highway had been rerouted 5 years ago, and the town of Harmony Creek had been slowly dying ever since. Alex's shop was just another casualty. He sat on a worn stool, a single dim bulb buzzing overhead, staring at the eviction notice in his hand. The red ink of the word "final" seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Mr. Henderson, the man who owned half the town and all of its misery, had given him one last week. 1 week to come up with 3 months of back rent or lose the only home, the only legacy he had ever known. He was a good mechanic, maybe even a great one. He had a feel for engines, an intuition for the secret language of metal and mechanics. But he was a terrible businessman. He gave discounts to neighbors who were struggling. He let payments slide. He had his father's hands, but also his father's soft heart. And in a town like this, a soft heart was a liability. That was when the sound broke the suffocating silence. It wasn't the familiar purr of a local sedan. It was a guttural, sputtering cough, a death rattle of a powerful engine giving up the ghost. Alex looked up, wiping a greasy hand on his already filthy jeans. A motorcycle, a huge black and chrome beast of a machine, had coasted to a stop right in front of his open bay door. It was a classic Harley-Davidson, a panhead by the look of it, lovingly maintained but clearly in distress. The man who swung his leg over the seat was even larger than the bike. He had to be 6'5", with a chest as broad as an oak barrel, and arms roped with muscle and covered in a tapestry of faded ink. A thick, gray-streaked beard cascaded down his chest, and his hair was pulled back in a tight braid. He wore a leather vest, a coat covered in patches. Alex's eyes were drawn to the largest one, the one that stretched across the man's massive back. It depicted a grinning skull in a feathered headdress. Below it, in bold letters, were 2 words that sent a jolt of primal fear through anyone who saw them: Hell's Angels. The biker pulled off his helmet, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun for 50 years. He surveyed the dilapidated shop with a flat, unreadable expression. His eyes, small and dark, finally landed on Alex. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, stranded. Alex felt a familiar knot of apprehension tighten in his gut. This was trouble. Everyone knew who these men were. They were legends, boogeymen, the 1% who lived by their own rules. The sensible thing to do was to say he was closed, to point the man toward the next town 30 miles down the road, and hope he left without incident. His financial ruin was bad enough. He didn't need to invite a different kind of ruin into his life. He saw a curtain twitch in the window of the bakery across the street. Mrs. Gable was watching, probably already on the phone. In Harmony Creek, a man like this was not a customer. He was an event, a harbinger. But then Alex looked past the patches and the tattoos. He looked at the bike. He saw the way the man's hand rested on the fuel tank, a gesture of almost paternal frustration. And he saw the deep lines of exhaustion around the man's eyes. Alex was a mechanic, and a broken engine was a broken engine, no matter who owned it. He stood up, his joints popping in protest. The biker's gaze was intense, a silent appraisal that seemed to weigh Alex's very soul. Alex had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who had lived hard lives. Men for whom trust was a currency more valuable than gold. He was a former army mechanic, having served a 4-year tour before his father's health brought him home. He had worked on Humvees in dusty, dangerous places, and he knew the look of a man whose machine, whose lifeline, had failed him at the worst possible moment. He recognized the vulnerability hidden beneath the intimidating exterior. "She gave out on me," the biker rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly sound, like stones tumbling downhill. It wasn't a question or a plea, just a statement of fact. Alex nodded, walking slowly toward the magnificent, silent machine. He didn't feel afraid anymore. He felt a sense of purpose, a familiar call to action that momentarily pushed the eviction notice and the mountain of bills from his mind. "Looks like a panhead," Alex said, his voice quiet. 74 cubic inch. What year? A 58? A flicker of surprise, maybe even respect, crossed the biker's face. 59. Most people just call it an old Harley. Most people don't know what they're looking at, Alex replied, his fingers already hovering over the engine casing, feeling for residual heat, his mechanic's senses taking over. He saw what others missed. He saw the custom-tooled leather of the seat, the perfectly polished chrome that spoke of countless hours of care, the slight wear on the hand grips that told a story of thousands of miles traveled. This wasn't just a vehicle, it was a part of the man who rode it. He spent a few minutes in diagnostic silence, his mind working through the possibilities. It wasn't fuel, it wasn't spark. It was something deeper, something mechanical and catastrophic. "Sounds like you dropped a valve seat," Alex finally announced. "It's a common problem on these old panheads if they aren't rebuilt just right." The biker's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. It was the posture of a man hearing the worst possible news. That was a major repair, a full top-end rebuild. It meant hours of labor and expensive, hard-to-find parts. "Can you fix it?" "I can," Alex said simply, "but it'll take time, and it won't be cheap." He hated that part. He hated talking about money. This was the moment. The biker reached for his back pocket, for his wallet, and then he froze. His hand patted his other pockets, a slow, methodical search that grew more frantic with each empty pat. A dark cloud passed over his face. He looked up at Alex, and for the first time, the intimidating facade crumbled completely. In its place was the raw, humbling look of a man utterly adrift. "My wallet," the biker said, his voice strained. "It's gone. Must have fallen out on that last stretch of bad road." He ran a hand over his face, the picture of defeat. "I've got nothing on me, not a damn cent." This was the signal. It wasn't a mouthed word or a secret sign. It was a confession of vulnerability, an admission of powerlessness that was more profound coming from a man who radiated power. He was stranded, broke, and at the mercy of a stranger in a town that already feared him. He looked around, at the failing light, at the empty street. He was a giant, but in that moment, he seemed small. Then he did something that cemented Alex's decision. The biker began to unlace the leather ties on his kut. "Look," he said, his voice low and serious. "This is my kut. My life is on this vest. I'll leave it with you, as collateral. And my ring." He twisted a heavy silver ring on his finger, one bearing the club's death head insignia. "It's worth more than the repair. I'll come back for them, I give you my word." Alex's blood went cold, but not from fear. It was from a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy. He saw the desperation in the man's offer. For a man like this, a member of a 1% club, his kut wasn't just clothing. It was his identity, his history, his honor. Offering it as collateral was like offering a piece of his own soul. Alex knew, with absolute certainty, that this man was telling the truth. He was an honorable man in a dishonorable situation. He saw his own reflection in the biker's predicament. He too was on the verge of losing everything that defined him: his father's shop, his livelihood, his place in the world. They were two men, from entirely different universes, stranded on the same island of desperation. "You keep your vest," Alex said, his voice firm. The words surprised even himself. The biker, whose name Alex still didn't know, stopped, his hands frozen on the leather ties. He stared at Alex, suspicion and confusion warring in his eyes. "What?" "I said keep it," Alex repeated. He took a deep breath, the scent of oil and gasoline suddenly smelling like purpose again. I'll fix your bike. I told you I can't pay you, the biker stated, his tone flat, testing him. I heard you, Alex said, turning to grab a wrench. Payment's not always money. Sometimes it's just getting a man back on the road. Now help me push her inside. We're losing the light. The decision was made. It was a terrible business decision. It was financial insanity. Every minute he spent on this bike was a minute he wasn't trying to find a paying job, a minute he wasn't pleading with the bank or trying to sell off spare parts. He was investing his most precious resource, time, into a black hole. He looked at the red-stamped eviction notice still sitting on his stool. He was choosing to help this stranger over helping himself. It made no sense. And yet, it was the only choice he could make. His father had always told him, a man's character isn't measured by what he has in his wallet, but by what he does when no one is watching. People were watching now. Mrs. Gable was definitely still at her window, but they didn't understand. This felt different. It felt right. The biker, who finally introduced himself with a single gruff word, Grizz, helped Alex wheel the massive Harley into the center of the shop. The bike settled onto the main lift like a king returning to his throne. For the next 6 hours, Alex worked with a focus he hadn't felt in months. The worries about the rent, the shop, the slow decay of his life all faded into the background. There was only the engine. He pulled the top end apart with practiced efficiency. Just as he'd suspected, a valve seat in the rear cylinder had come loose and been hammered into oblivion by the piston. It had chewed up the cylinder head and the piston itself. It was a mess, a costly, time-consuming mess. He had one, and only one, set of piston and head components that would fit this vintage engine. He'd been saving them for a restoration project he'd hoped would bring in a big payout. A paying customer. Grizz sat on a stool, watching in near total silence. He didn't hover. He didn't offer useless advice. He just watched, his presence a quiet, heavy thing in the corner of the garage. He nursed a bottle of water Alex had given him and observed the mechanic's hands as they moved with a surgeon's precision. He saw the care, the expertise, the sheer love for the machine that flowed from Alex's fingertips. Around 9 o'clock, the squeal of expensive tires on asphalt broke the quiet rhythm of the garage. A luxury sedan pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness and flooding the bay. Mr. Henderson stepped out. He was a small, neat man in a suit that cost more than Alex made in a month. His face was a permanent sneer, his eyes like little chips of ice. "Working late, Miller?" Henderson called out, his voice dripping with condescension. He peered into the garage, his gaze falling on the disassembled Harley and then on the massive, bearded man sitting in the corner. His sneer deepened. "I see you found some new clientele. I hope he's paying in cash. You're going to need it." Alex's hands stopped moving. He felt a hot flush of anger and shame. "I'm working, Mr. Henderson." Henderson stepped into the bay, his polished shoes carefully avoiding a patch of oil on the floor. He looked at Grizz with open disgust. "This is what you're wasting your time on? This filth? You're a week from being on the street, and you're running a charity for criminals." Before Alex could respond, Grizz slowly stood up. He didn't say a word, but he grew, his sheer size seeming to suck the air out of the room. Henderson, who was used to intimidating everyone, took an involuntary step back, his bravado faltering. "You're in my way," Grizz rumbled, his voice dangerously low. Henderson's face paled. He looked from Grizz back to Alex, his anger returning as his fear subsided. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and threw it onto the workbench next to the delicate carburetor parts. "This is your formal, final notice. 1 week, Miller. 7 days. Then the locks get changed. And don't think your new friend here can do anything about it. The sheriff will be here with me." He gave Grizz one last hateful glare, scurried back to his car, and sped off into the night. The air in the garage was thick with tension. "I'm sorry about that," Alex said, his voice tight. Grizz just grunted. "Man's a vulture." He looked at the eviction notice, then back at the bike. He didn't say another word, but a new understanding passed between them. He now knew the true cost of the work Alex was doing. Alex took a deep breath and went back to the engine. He worked past midnight, lapping the new valve seats, measuring clearances to 1/1000th of an inch, reassembling the complex machinery with the care of a watchmaker. Finally, it was done. He reconnected the fuel line, checked the oil, and stood back. "Try her now," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Grizz walked to the bike, swung a leg over, and hit the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, and then erupted into a thunderous, perfect roar. It was a beautiful, healthy sound, the sound of life. A wide, genuine smile broke through Grizz's granite facade, transforming his face. He revved the engine, and the sound echoed through the sleeping town like a declaration of victory. He cut the engine and looked at Alex. The gratitude in his eyes was overwhelming. "I don't know what to say." "Just ride safe," Alex said, wiping his hands on a rag. He was exhausted, but he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. "She should hold. I used good parts." Grizz nodded slowly. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and a pen. He scribbled something on it and held it out to Alex. "My number, and my name, the real one. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call." Alex took the paper. "I'll be all right." He didn't say that in a week there would be no shop to call. "No," Grizz said, his eyes locking onto Alex's. "You call." He mounted his bike, gave Alex one last, long look, and with a final nod, he rode off into the darkness, the sound of his perfectly tuned engine fading into the distance. Alex was left alone in the silence, with his greasy hands, his empty pockets, and a final eviction notice. The week that followed was the longest of Alex's life. He made a few frantic calls, trying to secure a loan, but his credit was shot. He tried to sell some of his more valuable tools, but the offers were insultingly low. Hope dwindled with each passing day, replaced by a grim resignation. He started packing his father's things into cardboard boxes, the metallic scent of the tools mixing with the dusty smell of memories. Each wrench, each socket, was a piece of his past he was about to lose. The townspeople who had seen the biker treated him with a new wariness, as if he had invited a plague into their midst. He was more alone than ever. On the final day, a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Grizz had ridden away, the sky was a flat, unforgiving gray. Alex was packing the last box of his father's old repair manuals when Mr. Henderson's sedan pulled up, just as he had promised. The county sheriff's car pulled in right behind him. Sheriff Thompson was a decent man, but the law was the law. He got out of his car with a reluctant look on his face. "Alex," the sheriff said, his voice full of pity, "I'm sorry. It's time." Henderson was practically beaming, holding a shiny new padlock and a chain. "Let's get this over with," he said, striding toward the door. "I've already got a new tenant lined up, a franchise. They know how to make money." Alex felt a profound emptiness. It was over. He had failed. He had failed his father. He had failed himself. He stood motionless, a single wrench clutched in his hand, as Henderson prepared to lock away his entire life. And then he heard it. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration he felt in the soles of his worn-out boots, more than he heard with his ears. Sheriff Thompson paused, his hand on his holster, and looked down the empty main street. Henderson stopped fiddling with the lock, an annoyed expression on his face. The hum grew into a rumble. The rumble grew into a roar. It was the sound of an approaching army, a wave of controlled thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the sleepy town. Windows rattled. The dusty glass of the bakery across the street vibrated. Mrs. Gable's face appeared, pale and terrified. Then they appeared, cresting the small hill at the edge of town. It was a sea of chrome and black leather. One headlight became 2, then 10, then 50, then 100. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, a river of steel and horsepower flowing down Harmony Creek's main street. At the very front, on a perfectly restored 1959 Panhead, was Grizz. They didn't slow down. They rode directly toward the garage, their engines a deafening chorus. Alex, Henderson, and the sheriff were frozen in place, mesmerized by the terrifying spectacle. The column of bikers split, half flanking the left side of the street, half the right, until Miller's Auto and Repair was completely surrounded. 200 motorcycles, 200 Hell's Angels. The last bike pulled into place, and in an instant, 200 engines were cut. The silence that fell was more shocking than the noise had been. The town was paralyzed. People peered from behind curtains, from doorways, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. This was the stuff of nightmares, an invasion. Henderson's face had gone from smug to ashen. He looked at the silent army of bikers, then at Alex, a dawning, horrified understanding in his eyes. Grizz swung his leg off his bike. He walked with a slow, deliberate purpose, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't look at Alex. His eyes were fixed on the small, trembling form of Mr. Henderson. He stopped a foot away from the landlord, his shadow completely enveloping the smaller man. Several other bikers, all of them huge and impassive, dismounted and stood behind him, a wall of leather and muscle. "You're in our way," Grizz said, the same words he had used a week ago, but now they carried the weight of an entire army. Henderson stammered, holding up the padlock like a crucifix. This is private property. Sheriff, do something." Sheriff Thompson didn't move. He was a small-town cop, but he wasn't a fool. He was drastically outnumbered, and he recognized the look of a man who was completely in control. Grizz hadn't made a single threat, but the air crackled with power. Grizz finally turned his gaze from Henderson to the padlock in his hand. "That's for my friend's garage," he stated calmly. He then looked at Alex, who was still standing by the workbench, utterly stunned. "Heard you were having some landlord trouble." Henderson found a sliver of his courage. "He hasn't paid his rent. The law is on my side. This is a legal eviction." "The law," Grizz said, a slight, humorless smile touching his lips. He reached into his coat again, but this time, he didn't pull out a piece of paper. He pulled out a thick, bulging envelope. He tossed it onto the hood of Henderson's sedan. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "What is this?" Henderson asked, his voice shaking. "That," Grizz announced, his voice booming in the silence, "is our counteroffer. We're not renting, we're buying. The building, the lot, everything. That's a cash offer for 20% above market value. You'll take it. You'll sign the deed over to the new owner, and then you'll get in your car and you will never, ever bother our friend Alex again." The rescue was complete. It wasn't just a rescue from an eviction. It was a full-scale liberation. Henderson stared at the envelope, then at the 200 impassive faces staring back at him. He knew it wasn't a negotiation. It was a command. He snatched the envelope, his greed warring with his fear, and scurried over to the sheriff. Sheriff Thompson, who had been a silent observer, finally spoke. He looked not at Henderson, but at Alex. He saw the wrench still clutched in his hand, the stunned disbelief on his face. Then he looked at Grizz. "His instincts were right," the sheriff said, a note of pure respect in his voice. He was speaking to himself as much as to anyone else. He had heard the stories of Alex fixing the biker's ride for free. He, like the rest of the town, had thought Alex was a fool. Now he understood. He turned to Henderson. "You heard the man. Let's go down to the office and make this legal." Alex watched, speechless, as the sheriff escorted a defeated and trembling Henderson away. The threat that had shadowed his life for months was gone, just like that. Neutralized. He looked at Grizz, his mind struggling to process the sheer scale of what had just happened. Grizz walked over and clapped a hand on Alex's shoulder. The weight of it was grounding, real. "I told you to call," he said, a genuine smile in his eyes. I didn't," Alex stammered. "How did you know?" "We have friends everywhere," Grizz said simply. "Word gets around. A man in Harmony Creek helps one of our brothers, asks for nothing in return, even when he's about to lose everything himself. That's honor. Our club is built on that. You showed us honor, Alex. We're just paying it back." He then handed Alex a set of documents that the club's lawyer had already prepared. At the top of the deed, under New Owner, was a name, Alex Miller. He didn't just save the shop, he had bought it for him. Alex stared at the paper, his vision blurring. The knot of fear and failure he had carried for so long finally broke, and a wave of overwhelming gratitude washed over him. He looked up at the hundreds of bikers who were now dismounting, their faces no longer intimidating, but open and friendly. Then, the first one walked up. He was another mountain of a man with a long gray ponytail. "Heard you're the best panhead mechanic in the state," he said, pulling a thick wad of cash from his pocket. "Mine's been running a little rough. Got time to take a look?" He dropped the cash on the workbench. It was more than Alex made in a good month. Another biker followed, and another. "My transmission is slipping. Need an oil change. Can you tune my carburetor?" They filled his shop, not with threats, but with business. They brought their machines, their brotherhood, and their gratitude, breathing life back into the dying garage. They handed him cash, slapped him on the back, and shared stories of the road. They weren't just saving his shop. They were making it the most successful business in a 100-mile radius, overnight. Alex stood in the middle of it all, the deed to his father's shop clutched in his hand, the smell of gasoline and hot metal filling the air. He was surrounded by the very men the world had taught him to fear, and in their presence, he had never felt safer. His despair was gone, replaced by a hope so bright it felt like the sun. This was the first step, not just to financial healing, but to a new life he could never have imagined. 1 year later, the sign outside read, "Angel's Wing Custom Cycles." The old faded paint of Miller's Auto was gone, replaced by a gleaming professional sign, a gift from the club. The shop itself had doubled in size. Alex had knocked down the wall to the adjoining, long-abandoned storefront, which he now owned, and created a state-of-the-art motorcycle repair and customization center. The empty bays were a distant memory. Now, there was a waiting list. Harleys from 3 states away were lined up outside, their owners happy to wait for the man they called the Angel's Mechanic. The walls of the shop were a museum of his new life. They were covered with signed photographs of him with Grizz and other club members. There were patches from chapters all over the country, thank you gifts from bikers he had helped. In a glass case, right next to his father's first wrench, was a silver ring with a death head insignia, identical to the one Grizz wore. It was a gift, a symbol of his status as an honored friend of the club. His bond with Grizz had grown into a deep, familial friendship. The old biker was a regular visitor, often showing up unannounced with a bag of greasy burgers and a new engine puzzle for Alex to solve. They would sit for hours amidst the noise and the grease, 2 men from different worlds who had found common ground in honor and steel. Alex was a regular guest at the club's charity events, his presence always met with cheers and respect. He had found a brotherhood he never knew he was looking for. The town of Harmony Creek had changed too. The fear that had gripped them that day had slowly transformed into a strange kind of civic pride. The annual Angel's Run, a charity ride organized by Alex and Grizz's chapter, had become a major event. Hundreds of bikers descended on the town, not to cause trouble, but to raise money for the local school and volunteer fire department. The event brought in more tourist revenue than the town had seen in a decade. Mrs. Gable now sold a special biker's dozen at her bakery during the run. The bikers had become a part of the town's identity, and Alex's shop was the bridge between those two worlds. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Alex was leaning over the engine of a vintage Sportster, a young apprentice named Leo at his side. Leo was a local kid, aimless and headed for trouble before Alex had offered him a job. Alex was teaching him not just how to fix bikes, but how to live a life with purpose. "Hand me that torque wrench," Alex said. As Leo passed it to him, the kid looked around at the bustling shop, at the gleaming bikes, at the photo of Alex standing with 200 Hells Angels. "I still can't believe this all happened," Leo said in awe. "All because you fixed one guy's bike for free." Alex paused, a faint smile on his face. He looked at the kid, and in his eyes he saw his younger self. He saw the same uncertainty, the same search for a path. "Kindness is never a waste, Leo," Alex said, his voice quiet but sure. "It's an investment. You never know whose engine you're really fixing. Sometimes you're fixing a whole lot more."